I still remember the day I handed Harriet Langford that umbrella as if it were yesterday. She was the most powerful chief executive in London, the woman who had built Langford Dynamics from nothing, and yet she was escorted out of her own building in the city like a trespasser, with nothing but the clothes on her back. Outside, the rain hit hard and cold. She sat on a bench in the small park across the street, alone for the first time in years. I had just finished my overnight shift and was heading home when I saw her. I walked over and handed her an umbrella. What happened next changed everything for both of us. As she later told me, the morning had started like any other. She arrived at Langford Dynamics early, coffee and her agenda already running through her head before the lift doors opened. She wore the kind of calm that powerful people wear, not because life was easy, but because showing anything else was a luxury she had never allowed herself. The boardroom on the upper floor was already half full when she walked in, and no one looked up in a way that seemed unusual. That was the first thing she missed. Victor Harrington was already seated at the far end of the table. He had his jacket on, which was rare for early meetings. He usually kept things casual until the investors arrived. He gave her a small nod when she sat down, the kind of nod that looked like good morning but meant nothing at all. She opened her folder and moved on. She had a restructuring proposal to present, a new credit risk model her team had spent months building. She had thought about almost nothing else for weeks. She was ready. The meeting opened without incident. 2 agenda items passed quickly. Then Victor set down his pen and asked for the floor. What followed took just a few minutes. He had spent months quietly acquiring shares, small blocks at first, then larger ones bought through intermediaries and shell accounts that never flagged a single alert. By the time she was sitting in that room, Victor Harrington had already become the single largest individual shareholder of Langford Dynamics. He had done it carefully, patiently, and entirely without her knowledge. The 4 board members who voted with him had been aligned for some time. She did not move while he spoke. She kept her hands flat on the table and her face completely still, the way she had trained herself to look during hostile negotiations. But this was not a negotiation. By the time Victor finished his statement and the vote was called, she already knew what the count would be. She was removed from her own company in the time it took most people to drink a cup of coffee. The room stayed quiet after the result was read aloud. No one made eye contact with her. The 2 board members who had voted in her favor stared at the table. The others gathered their things with a practiced indifference that told her this moment had been rehearsed. Victor folded his hands in front of him and looked at her with something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite guilt. A blank expression she had never seen on him before, which made her realize she had never really looked at him closely enough. Security arrived shortly after. 2 men in gray uniforms stood near the door and said nothing, but their presence said everything. She was asked to surrender her access badge and leave the building. She would be permitted to collect personal items from her office at a scheduled time with supervision. Effective immediately, she was no longer chief executive of Langford Dynamics. She walked out through the lobby without a word. The receptionist who had greeted her every morning for years looked down at her keyboard. The security guard at the front desk, a man who always asked about her weekend, turned to answer a phone that was not ringing. The lift doors opened and closed around strangers. And then she was outside, standing on the pavement of a street she had crossed 1,000 times, and the rain was already falling. It came down fast and cold, the kind of autumn rain that arrives without warning and soaks through a jacket in minutes. She stood on the pavement for a moment without moving. No assistant would be coming down with an umbrella. No car was waiting at the curb. Her phone had messages she could not bring herself to open yet. She crossed the street in the rain and sat down on a bench at the edge of the small park that faced the building, the park she had walked past every day for years without ever once sitting in. From that bench, she could still see the entrance to Langford Dynamics, the glass doors, the polished lobby, the company name in brushed steel above the revolving door. She had chosen that font herself. She had argued for it in a meeting that ran over schedule because she believed the details mattered. Sitting in the rain now, she could not explain why any of it had ever felt important. The emptiness that settled over her was not the sharp pain of grief. It was quieter and heavier than that, the feeling of having been completely wrong about something for a very long time without ever knowing it. She had believed Victor was building something with her. She had believed the people in that room respected what she had made. She had believed that being good at her job was a kind of protection. All of it had been wrong, and the wrongness of it sat in her chest like cold water. She did not hear me approach over the sound of the rain. I was carrying a mop bucket on wheels, which I left on the path nearby, and I was holding a plain black umbrella that I extended toward her without ceremony, the way you might hold a door open for someone, a reflex, not a gesture. I was wearing the gray uniform of the building's maintenance crew, worn at the elbows, the kind of clothes that become invisible in a city that moves as fast as London. I worked the overnight shift inside the Langford Dynamics building, cleaning the floors, the windows, the bathrooms on every floor that executives used without ever thinking about who cleaned them. I had just come off my shift and was heading home when I saw her. I did not recognize her. I did not know her name, her title, or what had happened earlier on the upper floor. I saw a woman sitting alone in the rain on a bench, and I did what seemed obvious to me. "You're going to get completely soaked," I said. My voice was even, not unkind, the way someone speaks when they are not trying to start a conversation, but are also not willing to walk past. She looked up at me. She was used to people approaching her with an agenda, a pitch, a request, a carefully worded favor. She had learned to read the angle in people's eyes before they finished their first sentence. But I had no angle. I was just standing there with an umbrella, looking at her the way you look at a problem that has a simple solution. She took the umbrella. She was not sure why. Maybe because it was the only offer she had received all day that came without conditions attached. I reached into the side pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small thermos, the plain metal kind that workers carried, and set it on the bench beside her. "Coffee's still hot," I said. "You look like you could use it more than I can." I moved to leave, which surprised her. Most people who gave something expected something in return, even if it was just acknowledgement. But I had already started walking back toward my cart, unhurried, like the whole thing had cost me nothing, because to me it had not. She looked at the thermos beside her, then back at me walking away in the rain. She had spent the last decade in rooms full of people who spoke in complete paragraphs and said nothing real. And here was a stranger who had said 4 sentences and meant every one. "Wait," she said. I turned back. She did not know what she wanted to say. She only knew that the idea of sitting alone on that bench with the thermos and the umbrella and the glass building across the street with her name still on it felt unbearable in a way that the boardroom had not. The boardroom had required her to be hard. This bench did not. "Thank you," she said. And then, after a moment, "I do not usually sit in the rain." "Most people do not," I said, and there was nothing sarcastic in it. I stood there for a moment, not in any hurry, which was itself unusual for a city where everyone was always moving towards something. And in that stillness, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but it shifted. Harriet Langford, who had not let her guard down in longer than she could remember, moved a few inches to the left on the bench. I sat down. We sat under the umbrella while the rain came down on the park and on the street and on the glass building across from us that still had her name on it. She held the thermos with both hands. The coffee was black and slightly bitter, the kind that came from a petrol station or a break room machine. Nothing like the single-origin pour-over that her assistant had delivered to her desk every morning. It was the best thing she had tasted in months. I did not fill the silence with small talk, which was rare. Most people, when sitting next to someone who was visibly unraveling, reached for words the way they reached for a first aid kit. Not because the words helped, but because doing nothing felt wrong. I just sat there, hands resting on my knees, watching the rain with the patience of someone who had learned that not everything needed a response. She was the one who spoke first. "Do you work in that building?" she asked, nodding toward Langford Dynamics. "Overnight shift," I said. "Just finished." She looked at my gray uniform, the worn elbows, the cart I had left on the path. "How long?" "A few years," I said. "Give or take." She thought about that. I had been in that building cleaning the floors she walked across, emptying the bins in conference rooms where she made decisions worth hundreds of millions of pounds, and she had never once registered my existence. Not my face, not my name, not the fact that someone had to show up at night to make the place look the way it did when she arrived. That realization did not arrive gently. "I worked in that building too," she said. It was the most honest version of the truth she could offer without explaining everything. I glanced at her once, reading the statement for what it was. "Worked," I repeated, past tense. I did not press it. She looked down at the thermos. "You studied engineering," she said, not a question, because she had noticed the way I had assessed the wheel on my cart when one of the joints had shifted. A quick mechanical read that most people would not make. It was the kind of instinct that came from training, not habit. I was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," I said, "long time ago." Life moved in a different direction. I said it plainly, without self-pity, the way a person states a fact about weather. It rained, plans changed. I had not built my identity around what I was supposed to become, and that absence of resentment was something she felt before she understood it. "Do you regret it?" she asked. I thought about it, which she appreciated. I did not answer immediately to seem thoughtful. I actually thought about it. "There are days," I said, "but mostly no. The work I do now, it is honest. You show up, you do it, and at the end of the night, the floor is clean. There is no politics in a clean floor." She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because the simplicity of it hit something she had not touched in a long time. There is no politics in a clean floor. She had spent years in a building full of people fluent in the language of strategy and leverage, and none of them had ever said anything that landed as cleanly as that. "The problem with the kind of work I do," she said, "is that you can never tell when it is clean." I turned to look at her properly for the first time. "What kind of work is that?" She thought about how to answer without telling me everything. Then she decided she did not want to manage the conversation. She was tired of managing things. "I built a company," she said, "financial technology, started it from nothing, grew it for a decade, and this morning the person I trusted most used that company to push me out of it." I held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the building. "The guy in the suit who came down earlier," I said, "dark jacket, walked out with 3 other people. All of them looked like they just won something." She felt something cold move through her chest. "You saw them?" "I was still finishing up the lobby when they came through," I said. "The tall one. He had that look like he had been waiting to walk out that door for a long time. That was Victor exactly." She had just never seen him from the outside before, from the lobby floor, from the angle of someone invisible. That was what he looked like, a man who had been waiting. She wondered how many other people had seen it before she did. The rain softened slightly, neither of us moved. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead," I replied. "If you had built something, something real, something you cared about, and someone took it from you, what would you do?" I was quiet, not the silence of someone who did not know, but of someone choosing which true thing to say. "Depends on why I built it in the first place," I said. "If I built it to win, then losing it would be the worst thing. But if I built it because I believed in what it was supposed to do." I let the sentence find its own end. "Then what got taken was the building, not the belief." She stared at the entrance of Langford Dynamics across the street. She had told that story 100 times, the founding story, the origin, the vision. She had given that speech at conferences and pitch meetings and university panels. She knew every word of it. But sitting on this bench, she could not honestly say what she had believed in for the last few years. At some point, the company had become the point. The winning had become the thing, and she had stopped asking what any of it was actually for. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not announced, just a quiet interior collapse of something she had been holding up for years without realizing how much weight it had become. She did not say any of that out loud. But something in her expression must have shifted, because I looked at her once more with a steadiness that was not pity and not curiosity, just recognition, the kind that passed between people who had both been through a version of the same reckoning. "There is a difference," first, I said, "between a company that serves people and one that just uses them. The first kind is hard to build, the second kind is easy to steal." Later, she learned exactly what Victor intended to do with what he had stolen. The restructuring announcements came out in stages, each one framed in the careful language of optimization and strategic realignment, which meant that people were being let go. First the product teams, then the operations staff, then the risk and compliance division that she had spent years assembling, the one that had kept the company from making the kind of bets that destroyed firms from the inside. One by one, the pieces that had made Langford Dynamics what it was were being stripped out and sold or dissolved, and what remained was being repositioned as a high-frequency trading vehicle for a small group of institutional investors. Former employees reached out to her in the days that followed, not many at first, then more. Some sent emails that were careful and professional. Others called and did not bother to hide that they were frightened. A few had been with her from the beginning, people who had taken lower salaries because they believed in what she said the company was building. They were the ones hardest to read when they asked what she was going to do. She had no answer. She had no board seat, no legal standing, and no remaining equity that gave her any meaningful leverage. Victor's acquisition had been done correctly, which was the thing she could not get past. He had broken nothing except her trust, and trust was not something you could litigate. She had consulted 2 attorneys soon after, and both had told her the same thing in different ways. The law was not on her side, and fighting it would cost more than it would return. The city felt different to her during those weeks. She walked more than she had in years, because she no longer had a schedule that began early and ended at whatever hour the last crisis demanded. She walked through neighborhoods she had never had reason to visit, past the kinds of businesses she had only ever seen as data points, small, independent, badly capitalized, surviving anyway. She noticed things she had not noticed before. How much work went into things that most people took for granted? How many people were holding up systems that no one thought about until they failed? She thought about what I had said, the difference between a company that serves people and one that just uses them. She thought about the people who had called her, not the executives, not the board members, not the investors who were now sending cautious inquiries about whether she had plans. The ones she thought about were the junior analysts who had believed the pitch, the operations team that had come in on weekends, the woman in the compliance department who had flagged a risk assessment the year before that Victor had quietly buried and who had come to her directly because she trusted that it would be taken seriously. She had taken it seriously. And then she had moved on to the next thing. One evening, she found herself standing outside the Langford Dynamics building again, not to go in. Just standing there the way you stand in front of something you are trying to see clearly. She watched the overnight cleaning crew arrive through the service entrance at the side of the building. She recognized the gray uniforms. I was among them. I had my cart, my mop handle resting on the side, my jacket zipped against the cold. I noticed her before she said anything, and I nodded in a way that was neither surprised nor performative, just the acknowledgement of someone who expected that things were complicated and was not going to pretend otherwise. "You're back," I said. "I'm not going back in," she said. "I know," I replied. "You're standing on the outside." She looked at the building for another moment. "I've been thinking about what you said about building something that serves people." I adjusted the handle of my cart. "I remember." "I think I want to try," she said. "Not what I had, something different, something smaller and more honest." She looked at me directly. "I know how that sounds coming from someone who just ran a company with hundreds of employees." "It sounds like someone who learned something," I said, without inflection, without flattery. She had spent years surrounded by people who were paid to support her ideas, and she had slowly lost the ability to tell the difference between agreement and honesty. Standing on a pavement one evening, talking to a man with a mop cart, she felt that difference again. It was not comfortable. It was necessary. "I want to build the next one with people who understand what the work actually costs," she said. "Not just financially." She let that land. "I would like you to be part of it, not as a favor, because the way you think about this, about what a business owes the people inside it, that is the thing I did not have the first time, and I think it is the thing that matters most." I looked at her for a long moment. The street was quiet around us, the city doing its background hum. I was not a man who made decisions out of flattery or impulse, and she could see me turning it over with the same careful attention I gave everything else. "Tell me what you're actually building," I said. "Not the pitch, what it actually is." And that was the first real conversation we had about the company that did not yet have a name. The company had no name for the first few months. That was intentional. She had learned the hard way that names came with weight. They invited comparisons, triggered associations, gave people a story before the reality had a chance to form. So for the first few months, it was just a rented office on an upper floor of a building in the city of London, a folding table, 4 laptops, and a small group of people who had chosen to be there when they could have gone somewhere safer. I came in on evenings and weekends. At first, while I was still finishing out my notice at the overnight job, I had a way of walking into a room and reading the temperature of it without asking, knowing when the team needed someone to push back on an assumption and when they needed someone to simply be steady. I was not a tech executive, and I had never pretended to be one. But I asked the right questions, which turned out to be rarer and more valuable than she had expected. Most people in her previous life had asked questions designed to demonstrate their own intelligence. I asked questions because I actually wanted to know the answer. The core team was small by design. There was Marcus, who had run data infrastructure at Langford Dynamics for years and left voluntarily soon after Victor's restructuring began. There was Diana, a compliance attorney who had spent a decade watching financial technology companies build products that technically followed the law and practically harmed the people who used them, and who had grown tired enough of the gap between those two things to do something about it. And there was me, whose title on the internal documents was listed as Director of Operations, and whose actual role was closer to the person who made sure we all remembered what we were doing this for when the pressure got high enough to make us forget. The product we were building was a credit access platform for small business owners who had been systematically underserved by traditional financial institutions. Not because they were bad risks, but because the models used to evaluate them had been designed around data sets that did not reflect how those businesses actually operated. It was not a new problem. It was in fact one of the oldest problems in financial technology, and every major firm in the industry had either ignored it or built something that made it worse. She had ignored it too during her time at Langford Dynamics because the margins were thinner and the customer acquisition costs were higher, and there were always more efficient ways to grow a balance sheet. She was not ignoring it anymore. The first investor meeting went badly. The partner at the firm was polite in the particular way that venture capital people were polite when they had already decided no but did not want to close a door completely. He asked about exit strategy early on, which told her everything she needed to know about what he was actually evaluating. She got through the rest of the meeting without changing her answer, which was that the exit strategy was building something that lasted, and that if that was not sufficient, she understood his position. He thanked her for her time, and she thanked him for his, and neither of them meant it. The second meeting went similarly. The third was worse, because the partner there had clearly read coverage of the Langford Dynamics situation and wanted to ask about it in a way that seemed like due diligence, but was actually an audition for whether she would perform contrition convincingly enough to be fundable. She did not perform it convincingly. She told him the direct version of what had happened, what she had got wrong, and what she intended to do differently. And he responded with the language of admiring the vision while having concerns about the timeline. She left that meeting and walked several streets back to the office without taking a taxi. Victor, meanwhile, had not been idle. She learned through industry channels that he had made calls, quiet ones, calibrated ones, the kind that never left a traceable record but landed with precision. A potential early investor, who had been close to committing, went silent after a lunch meeting that Victor had arranged shortly before. A financial trade publication ran a piece that described her new venture in terms that were not inaccurate, but were arranged in an order designed to make her look like someone chasing relevance rather than building something real. She read the piece twice and recognized Victor's fingerprints on it, the way you recognize a person's handwriting, not from any single letter, but from the pattern. She had expected the interference. What she had not expected was how little it diminished her. The version of herself that had existed months earlier would have responded to that article with legal threats and a counter-narrative, would have spent time managing the story rather than the work. Instead, she forwarded it to Marcus with a one-line note. "Let us make sure the product is the answer to this," and moved on. I saw the article. I did not bring it up directly, but the next evening I came in with a question about the loan evaluation model. We were building something about whether the waiting on cash flow consistency was capturing the right pattern for seasonal businesses. It was a good question, technically specific and practically important, and the hour we spent working through it was the most useful hour of the week. She understood what I was doing. I was redirecting the energy where it belonged. The first real funding came from an unexpected direction. A small family office run by a woman named Margaret Ainsworth, who had spent years in community banking before retiring and watching from a distance as the fintech industry rebuilt all the same walls she had spent her career trying to move. Margaret had read about Harriet, had read the unflattering article, and had then spent weeks researching the actual architecture of what she was building before she requested a meeting. The meeting lasted hours. At the end of it, Margaret wrote a check that was not large by venture standards, but was exactly enough to move the product from prototype to pilot. And she did it without asking about exit strategy once. "I am not investing in a transaction," Margaret told her before she left. "I am investing in a correction." The pilot launched quietly in Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds with a small group of business owners who had been referred through community development organizations. There were no press releases, there was no launch event, there was just the product running in the real world, doing the thing it was designed to do or failing to do it and needing to be fixed. It needed to be fixed several times in the first month. We fixed it. The second month was better. By the third month, the data was showing something that she had believed was possible, but had not allowed herself to fully commit to believing until she saw it in the numbers. The model worked, the risk was manageable, and the businesses that received access through the platform were performing in ways that the traditional lending frameworks had said they would not. Word moved the way real word moved, not through press releases but through people telling each other. A business owner in Manchester told another business owner in Manchester. A community development officer in Birmingham sent an email to a colleague in Leeds. Margaret Ainsworth mentioned it at a conference for regional banking executives without fanfare, the way she mentioned things she considered factual. The pilot grew past the boundaries she had originally drawn for it, not because she pushed it, but because the need had always been there and the product was finally meeting it. Langford Dynamics during this same period was moving in a sharply different direction. The changes Victor had made in the early months had produced the short-term numbers he had promised his institutional backers, but they had hollowed out the operational core of the company in ways that took time to become visible. The compliance division that she had built, which Victor had dissolved in the restructuring, had existed for reasons that were not obvious until it was gone. Regulatory inquiries were opened later. A key infrastructure partnership failed because the team that had managed the relationship had been among the first to be let go. By later years, the company that had once been considered one of the most innovative fintech firms in the country was being described in the same trade publications as a cautionary example of what happened when financial engineering replaced actual engineering. She did not follow this closely. She heard about it the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in, with a kind of distant awareness but no real stake in it anymore. The people she had once cared about at Langford Dynamics had mostly moved on. The ones who had joined her were building something else. The ones who had not were building their own things, and she wished them well without complication. What surprised her most about the years that followed was not the growth of the new company, though that came measured and real and built on something that could hold weight. What surprised her was the quietness of it. She had spent the previous decade of her career in a permanent state of urgency, convinced that the pace was necessary, that slowing down was indistinguishable from falling behind. The new work was not slow, but it was deliberate. And the difference between those two things turned out to be the difference between building a structure and building a foundation. I remained the person who asked the questions that needed asking. I had grown into the operational role fully, and the team that formed around me had the particular quality of people who had been chosen for clarity of purpose rather than impressiveness of resume. I never lost the instinct I had had on that bench in the rain, the willingness to sit with something difficult until it became honest rather than rushing it toward a resolution that only looked clean. She had tried to explain to an interviewer once what made me invaluable as a partner and had found that the most accurate answer was also the simplest. I cared about the right things, and I had never stopped caring about them when it became inconvenient. The conference was in Manchester several years after the morning she had been walked out of Langford Dynamics by security. It was a large gathering, the kind that filled a convention hotel and ran days of panels and keynotes attended by the people who built financial technology, and the people who regulated it, and the people who wrote about it, and the people who funded it. She had been invited to give the closing address. She had written and rewritten what she wanted to say several times before deciding that the only version worth giving was the direct one. She stood at the lectern and looked out at a room full of people she recognized, people she had competed with, people she had pitched to, people who had read the unflattering article years earlier and drawn their conclusions. She did not begin with the company or the product or the pilot data, though all of those things would be mentioned. She began with a bench in the rain. She told them about the morning she lost everything, the board vote, the security escort, the glass building across the street with the company name in the font she had chosen herself. She told them about sitting in the rain with nothing, no assistant, no car, no plan. She told them about a man in a gray uniform who had set a thermos down beside her without asking for anything in return, and about the things he had said that were so simple they were almost obvious and yet had undone something she had spent years building in the wrong direction. She did not dramatize it. The story was plain enough without dramatization. "I have given a lot of speeches about what it takes to build something," she said, looking across the room. "I have talked about vision and discipline and risk tolerance. All of those things are real, but I spent a long time building a company without understanding what it was supposed to be for." She let that sit for a moment before continuing. "The person who helped me understand that was not a board member or an investor or a mentor with a history of successful exits. He was the man who cleaned the lobby of my building every night after everyone else went home." The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms get quiet when they recognize something true. "The thing that changed my life was not a strategy," she said. "It was not a pivot or a second act or a lesson learned. It was a cup of coffee from a thermos and 4 sentences from a stranger who had no reason to stop and every reason to keep walking." She looked down for just a moment, then back up. "I think about that a lot. How many times we walk past the person who has the thing we actually need because we have decided in advance that they do not have it." She closed by saying what she had come to believe plainly, that a company was not defined by the floor it occupied or the valuation it carried. It was defined by the terms it offered the people inside it and the people it was supposed to serve. That was it. That was the whole thing. And it was not complicated once you stopped running fast enough to avoid knowing it. When she stepped back from the lectern, the applause was real. Not the polite kind that filled rooms as a formality, but the kind that meant people had heard something and were responding to it rather than to the occasion. She did not stay for the reception. She had a flight to catch and there was work to get back to. On the plane somewhere above the Midlands, she thought about the umbrella. She still had it, a plain black umbrella, nothing remarkable about it, sitting in the coat closet of the office where the company now operated out of an entire floor rather than a folding table. She had kept it not as a symbol, but as a reminder of the specific weight of the moment when someone who owed her nothing gave her something anyway. That kind of thing did not have a category in a balance sheet. It did not show up in any model. But it was the reason she was on that plane, and the reason the work meant something, and the reason she had learned, finally, late but not too late, that the most important thing a person could do with power was to remember exactly how it felt to be without it. From my perspective, as the man who once pushed a mop through the corridors of Langford Dynamics, the most valuable life lesson I carry from that fateful encounter with Harriet Langford is one that still brings a lump to my throat. True strength blooms not from towering ambitions or corporate victories, but from the humble recognition that we are all just one rain-soaked moment away from needing a stranger's kindness. There she was, the brilliant chief executive who had shaped the City of London's fintech landscape, reduced to sitting alone on a bench in the park opposite her former empire after Victor Harrington orchestrated her downfall. The rain fell relentlessly, mirroring the cold emptiness in her heart. Yet it was my worn umbrella and a simple thermos of coffee that sparked the shift. In sharing those quiet words about honest work and companies that serve rather than use, I witnessed her realize that power without purpose is hollow, and that overlooking the invisible hands that keep our world turning is the greatest oversight of all. Together we built something smaller, yet infinitely more meaningful, a credit platform supporting overlooked businesses across Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds, grounded in the very humility she learned that day. This emotional truth, that remembering the feeling of having nothing equips us to wield success with compassion, has transformed not only her life, but mine as well. If this story has touched your soul and reminded you of life's quiet lessons, do share in the comments the moment kindness changed your path, and please subscribe to the channel for more inspiring tales from the heart of Britain.